How did the United States rise from Civil War ashes to global economic power, only to face the Great Depression? Discover the booms, busts, and FDR's bold New Deal in S09 E22 of CSS Breakdown as we unpack NormanLowe's Mastering Modern World History. Today, we're going on an incredible deep dive, charting America's journey from the brutal scars of the Civil War through the vibrant energy of the Roaring '20s, the devastating Great Depression, and the radical transformation of the New Deal. Our mission is to extract the most powerful insights and, the surprising connections from this really pivotal era.
And it truly is a dramatic period, isn't it? The United States underwent immense societal and economic shifts at a pace that's almost hard to grasp. We're talking about rapid changes that created vastly contrasting experiences for different segments of the population. What's truly fascinating here is how seemingly isolated events, from industrial innovations to shifts in international policy, all interconnected. They weave together this incredibly complex and revealing historical narrative.
Okay, so let's unpack this right from the start. The Civil War's end in 1865 brought the abolition of slavery, a monumental shift that legally redefined millions of lives. But what was the immediate aftermath like, on the ground, for formerly enslaved people and really for the nation itself?
Well, the 13th Amendment did abolish slavery, and that was foundational, absolutely. However, the reality post-1865 was far from simple. Many white Americans, particularly in the South, fiercely resisted recognizing African Americans as equals. This led to aggressive efforts to deprive them of their newly granted rights.
How so? Through legal means.
Yes, partly through legal means like the infamous Black Codes, which restricted their freedoms, but also, very significantly, through brutal violence and intimidation. This era truly spurred the early civil rights movement, but it faced immense uphill battles with very limited tangible success for decades, really.
And against that backdrop of social upheaval, America wasn't just standing still, was it? We're seeing this explosion of industrial growth and an unprecedented wave of immigration. Yeah. What were the defining characteristics of this rapid expansion?
This was the very crucible of America's industrial might. The late 19th century saw a vast industrial revolution fueled by rich supplies of raw materials like coal, iron ore, and oil, and also the rapid expansion of railways that connected markets and resources across the continent. By 1914, the USA had easily surpassed Britain and Germany in output of key materials like coal, iron, and steel. It was becoming the major economic force on the world stage.
Wow, surpassing Britain and Germany.
Yeah, and this growth was utterly supercharged by immigration. The scale was truly immense. Between 1860 and 1930, over 30 million people arrived in the USA.
30 million, that's staggering.
It is. Initially, you saw large numbers from Ireland, Germany, and Sweden, but later the tide shifted dramatically, with millions from Russia, Poland, and Italy flooding in. Their motives were mixed. Many sought to escape grinding poverty and find better jobs, while others, particularly Jewish people after 1880, were fleeing brutal persecution and pogroms back home. This constant influx provided both the massive workforce and the growing markets needed for America's surging industries.
So, on the surface, this sounds like an unstoppable engine of prosperity. But was that prosperity truly shared? Or was this growth built on, let's say, a foundation of inequality?
Absolutely not shared equally. That's a crucial insight here. While industrialists and financiers like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller amassed vast fortunes, built huge industrial empires, that booming prosperity was far from reaching everyone. Immigrants, African Americans, and women often faced low wages, appalling living conditions, and incredibly poor working environments. Just terrible conditions.
This stark inequality must have led to pushback.
It did. It led to the formation of early labor unions and even the Socialist Party, which tried to improve conditions for workers. But before the First World War, big business was largely unsympathetic, very powerful. And these organizations had, frankly, very limited success against the immense power of the corporations.
Okay, so as the 20th century dawned, the U.S. is this economic powerhouse. But then World War I erupts. How did that global conflict impact America's role on the international stage, and what happened immediately after the war's end?
Well, America's entry into World War I, though late April 1917, played an undeniably important part in the defeat of Germany and her allies. President Woodrow Wilson's leading role at the Versailles Conference after the war truly solidified the USA's position as one of the world's great powers.
But didn't they then retreat from that role?
That's what's so fascinating. The immediate pivot after the war. America decided not to play an active, ongoing role in world affairs. This policy became known as isolationism. It was a bitter disappointment for Wilson when the Senate rejected both the Versailles Settlement and his beloved League of Nations in 1920. That decision truly set the tone for America's cautious post-war international stance, looking inward.
And this period also set the stage for how America was governed, especially with the different political philosophies emerging. What were the core ideas of the Republicans who would soon lead the country into the Roaring '20s?
Right. So the American system is a federal system, powers divided between the central government and states, and then the three branches: Congress, President, Supreme Court. You have the two main parties, Republicans and Democrats. Traditionally, Republicans drew strong support from the North, especially businessmen, industrialists. They were generally the more conservative party. They staunchly believed in high tariffs to protect American industry from foreign imports.
Protectionism.
Exactly. And they strongly advocated for a laissez-faire approach. That's the French term, let it be. Basically, minimal government interference in business and the economy. Presidents like Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover, who led the country during much of this period, really exemplified this non-interventionist stance. They believed it just wasn't the government's job to sort out economic and social problems.
So from that isolationist stance and a strong laissez-faire philosophy, America plunged headfirst into the Roaring '20s, a period synonymous with glamour and seemingly limitless prosperity. What fueled this incredible economic boom?
This was truly the great boom of the 1920s. Industrial production doubled between 21 and 29 with hardly any increase in workers, which meant huge increases in sales, profits, wages. The USA became the image of the world's most glamorous modern society, driven by a huge variety of new consumer goods, radios, refrigerators, washing machines.
Things we take for granted now, but revolutionary then.
Totally. And most notably, the motor car industry boomed. Cars went from about 7 million to nearly 24 million by 1929, largely thanks to Henry Ford's revolutionary Model T making cars affordable for many. Hollywood became a massive global exporter of culture, and new phenomena like jazz music and daring dances like the Charleston defined the era. It felt like a new age.
It sounds like a party that never stopped.
Yeah.
So what were the underlying forces propelling this boom? What made it all possible?
Well, several key factors converged. It was, in part, a continuation of that late 19th century industrial expansion we talked about. But World War I gave it an enormous, almost accidental boost. As European industries were disrupted by the war, countries turned to American goods. Plus, those Republican laissez-faire policies played a significant role. For example, the Fordney-McCumber tariff of 1922 protected American industry with high import duties. And general income tax cuts left people with more disposable cash. Then there was increased industrial efficiency mechanization, Henry Ford's moving production lines, Taylor's time and motion studies. These dramatically boosted productivity and lowered costs.
Making things cheaper to buy.
Exactly. And then there was advertising, which became big business, pushing these new consumer luxuries, often bought on credit, which was another key factor. And the motor car industry itself created this powerful ripple effect, stimulating expansion in allied sectors like tires, petroleum, tourism, road building. It just lifted so many boats.
But beneath all that glitz and glamour, we know this prosperity wasn't universal. Which segments of society were truly left behind? How did that inequality manifest itself?
Yeah, this is where the story gets darker and why it's often referred to as an age of intolerance for many. Wealth was distinctly not shared equally. Farmers, for instance. They'd prospered during WWII feeding Europe, but saw their profits dwindle in the 1920s. Overproduction, increased international competition. Prices fell.
And the government didn't step in. That laissez-faire idea.
Pretty much. The government offered little help. President Coolidge even vetoed the McNary-Haugen bill, which was designed specifically to assist them. Also, specific industries, like coal mining, suffered from new competition from oil and electricity, leading to widespread layoffs.
So farmers and some traditional industries struggled. What about African Americans and immigrants who'd contributed so much to the industrial boom itself?
They were largely left out of the prosperity. In the South, where most African Americans still lived, they faced rampant unemployment, low-paid, grueling jobs, and awful slum housing conditions. About 750,000 did move north seeking industrial work, but they often faced similar discrimination and segregation there too.
And this was also the era of the Klan's resurgence.
Yes, tragically. This period saw widespread persecution by the Ku Klux Klan, which incredibly claimed about 5 million members in 1924. They carried out assaults, whippings, lynchings, a reign of terror. Immigrants, particularly those from Eastern and Southern Europe, faced intense hostility from white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, YSPS. This nativism led to the highly restrictive Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which severely limited immigration based on national origins, cutting it down to just 150,000 annually.
Wow, so a real backlash against the very people fueling the growth. And for the average industrial worker, was that rising tide lifting all boats, even for them?
Not really. For industrial workers generally, real wages stagnated. They rose only about 1.4% annually between 1922 and 1929, which didn't keep pace with productivity gains. This meant widespread poverty persisted in industrial areas. Working conditions were often appalling, about 25,000 workers killed and 100,000 disabled each year on the job.
That's shocking.
It is. And workers had very limited rights to protest. Strikes were often crushed by force, sometimes violently, and unions were kept deliberately weak by employers and government policy. And then there was Prohibition, introduced in 1919, this noble experiment to ban alcohol. Well, it largely backfired. It fueled organized crime, speakeasies, bootlegging. Figures like Al Capone became notorious.
Leading to things like the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Exactly. It was incredibly violent and ultimately seen as a failure. Roosevelt repealed it in 1933. Even for women, despite gaining the right to vote in 1920, they still faced unequal treatment, lower wages for the same work, and limited professional opportunities. They were mostly stuck in jobs men didn't want.
So a decade of contradictions.
Yeah.
This brings us to October 1929. The economic optimism of the decade just shatters with the Wall Street crash. What happened on that infamous Black Tuesday, and what were the deeper underlying weaknesses that caused such a catastrophic downturn?
Right. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Share prices just plummeted. Thousands of investors were ruined overnight. The estimated loss was around $30 billion in stock value, an astronomical sum then. But here's the crucial insight. The crash itself was more of a symptom, not the sole cause of the depression that followed. The real causes lay much deeper within the economic structure of the 20s.
Okay, so what were those deeper issues?
Well, first, there was domestic overproduction. American industry was simply producing way too many goods for the home market to actually absorb. Efficiency was great, but people couldn't buy everything being made. Unsold stocks piled up, leading factories to cut back production and eventually shut down.
So too much supply and not enough real demand from average people.
Precisely. And that leads directly to the second major cause, a stark, unequal distribution of income. Industrial profits soared, like I said, 72% between 23 and 29. But industrial workers' wages barely budged, rising only about 8% in that same period, which was just 1.4% in real terms. This meant the general public, the actual consumers, had insufficient buying power to sustain the boom. They were relying heavily on credit, installment plans to purchase goods. Manufacturers, meanwhile, were unwilling to significantly reduce prices or raise wages, leading to this glut of consumer goods they couldn't sell.
Makes sense. What else?
Thirdly, there was falling demand for exports. Those U.S. tariffs, like the Fordey-McCumber Act, that were meant to protect American industry, they made it hard for European countries to sell their goods in the U.S. So European nations couldn't earn the dollars needed to buy American goods or repay their war debts to the U.S. This led to retaliatory tariffs from other nations, and American exports dropped sharply.
Got to shot themselves in the foot there.
In a way, yes. And finally, speculation was absolutely rampant in the stock market. This is key. People weren't buying stocks for long-term investment or dividends. They were borrowing heavily, often only putting down 10% of the share price, buying on margin purely to sell the shares quickly for a profit. This created an unsustainable bubble. Confidence alone drove prices up, based purely on the expectation they'd keep rising, not on the actual value or profits of the companies. Think of Radio Corporation of America's stock. It went from $85 to $505 without paying a dividend.
That sounds completely detached from reality.
It was. So when the first signs of slowing sales appeared, the smarter, better-informed investors began to quietly sell off their shares. This caused suspicion, then nervousness, then outright panic. Everyone rushed to sell before prices dropped further. This process, what economists call a self-fulfilling expectation, it's like everyone believes the bank will fail, so they all rush to withdraw their money, and then the bank does fail simply because of that belief. That's what happened on Wall Street. The rush to sell collapsed the prices.
What's truly devastating here is how quickly the effects spread beyond Wall Street, absolutely crushing ordinary Americans and then ripping through the global economy. What were the immediate human and international impacts?
Oh, the impact on people was immediate and utterly devastating. Millions of investors were ruined. If they'd bought on credit, their creditors lost heavily too. Thousands of banks, already shaky from their own speculation or loans to speculators, just closed their doors as millions rushed to withdraw their
So
savings.
even people who didn't own stocks lost everything.
Exactly. By 1933, fewer than 15,000 of the 25,000 banks from 1929 were still open. Millions of ordinary people lost their life savings through no fault of their own. Factories shut down en masse. Industrial production in 1933 was half of what it had been in 1929, and unemployment became catastrophic. Almost 14 million people were out of work by 1933. That's roughly a quarter of the entire labor force.
A quarter. It really paints a stark picture of desperation, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You had people queuing for bread, relying on charity soup kitchens, facing evictions from their homes. Homeless communities, shantytowns, starkly dubbed Hoovervilles after President Hoover, sprang up on the outskirts of cities. And you have to remember, there were essentially no government safety nets, no unemployment benefits, no sickness benefits to fall back on. Globally, the crisis was contagious.
How did it spread?
Other countries, especially in Europe, had become dependent on U.S. loans during the 20s. Those loans now completely stopped, and existing short-term loans were called in by desperate American banks. By 1931, much of Europe was in a similar economic plight. This also had profound political consequences. Existing democratic governments struggled to cope, and we saw the rise of right-wing, often authoritarian regimes in several countries as people looked for drastic solutions.
And what about President Hoover himself during this crisis? What was his philosophy, and how did he try to respond? He got the blame with the Hoovervilles.
Yes, he did. Hoover clung tightly to his philosophy of rugged individualism, the idea that people should succeed through their own efforts, that government handouts would weaken the national character, create a dependency culture. So he was famously reluctant to provide direct federal relief to the unemployed or the poor. His efforts were largely indirect and, frankly, ineffective. He encouraged employers not to cut wages, which they couldn't really afford not to do. He tried lending money to banks through the National Credit Corporation to stop them failing. He also declared a moratorium on war debt repayments. But his most disastrous move was probably signing the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, which raised tariffs even higher. It just provoked more retaliation and caused American exports and world trade generally to collapse even further. His failure to make any real impression on the crisis led to his decisive landslide loss in the 1932 election.
So in steps Franklin D. Roosevelt, a dynamic figure offering a new deal for the American people. What was his vision? How did his approach dramatically differ from his predecessor?
Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, brought a completely different energy and attitude to the White House. He came from a wealthy background, educated at Harvard, but he'd also faced personal adversity. Stricken with polio at 40, left paralyzed from the waist down, he exhibited this tremendous determination and personal resilience. And this determination he now brought to bear on dragging America out of the Depression. He was dynamic, seemed full of vitality, brimming with new ideas, willing to experiment. His communication skills were exceptional.
The fireside chats.
Exactly. Those radio addresses directly to the American people. They were incredibly effective at restoring confidence, making people feel the government was finally on their side. His inaugural speech in 1933 famously declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It set a tone of confidence, optimism, and immediate action. His core vision for the New Deal revolved around three main aims, often called the 3 Rs: relief for the millions suffering from poverty and homelessness, recovery to reduce unemployment, stimulate demand, and get the economy moving again, and reform to prevent future economic disasters by fixing the underlying problems in the financial system and economy.
So a total rejection of laissez-faire.
Completely. It was a dramatic shift. Roosevelt was prepared to intervene in economic and social affairs as much as he felt necessary. And crucially, he was willing to spend significant government money deficit spending to achieve these goals, something his predecessors had been deeply reluctant to do.
This raises an important question. What were some of the key measures of the New Deal? How did they attempt to address the massive, multifaceted problems of the Depression? It sounds like a huge undertaking.
It was an absolute avalanche of legislation and new agencies, particularly in the first 100 days of his presidency and continuing through the 1930s. It's hard to cover everything, but let's hit the highlights. In banking and finance, the government temporarily closed all banks the bank holiday to stop the panic, then reopened the sound ones with government guarantees for deposits through the FDIC. This restored public confidence. The Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC, was created, so think of it as a financial watchdog, policing the stock exchange to prevent the kind of reckless speculation that led to the crash.
Okay, shoring up the financial system first. What about the farmers?
For agriculture, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA, basically paid farmers not to grow certain crops or raise livestock, aiming to reduce the massive surpluses and therefore raise prices. Farmer incomes almost doubled by 1937 as a result, though it did have downsides, sometimes hurting poor tenant farmers and sharecroppers who were pushed off the land.
Paying farmers not to grow food, that must have been a radical concept at the time, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. And job creation was a huge, huge focus. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was very popular. It employed millions of young, unmarried men on conservation projects, planting trees to fight soil erosion, building reservoirs, creating national parks. The Public Works Administration, PWA, funded large-scale infrastructure projects, dams, bridges, hospitals, schools. Think big construction. Then there was the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, which funded a wider range of smaller projects, famously including jobs for artists, writers, musicians, and actors through things like the Federal Theater Project. Billions were spent putting people back to work.
So the government stepping in directly as an employer on a massive scale. What about stabilizing industry and providing direct relief?
Right. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or NRA, was ambitious. It tried to stabilize industry by setting tons of fair competition, which included abolishing child labor, setting maximum working hours and minimum wages, the idea being to spread work around more people. Businesses that complied displayed a blue eagle symbol, and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, provided direct federal cash grants to states to distribute for relief soup kitchens, clothing, basic necessities for the destitute.
And what about longer-term things like labor rights and a social safety net? Were those addressed?
Yes, definitely. The Wagner Act of 1935 was landmark legislation. It guaranteed workers the right to join unions and bargain collectively with their employers. It set up the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, to oversee union elections and protect workers from unfair labor practices. This led to a huge growth in union membership. The Fair Labor Standards Act followed in 1938, establishing a national minimum wage, a maximum 40-hour work week in many industries, and finally, making most forms of child labor illegal nationwide.
And Social Security, that's huge.
Absolutely fundamental. The Social Security Act of 1935 was arguably the most significant and lasting reform. It introduced a national system of old-age pensions funded by taxes on employers and employees, as well as unemployment insurance administered by the states but funded federally. It wasn't as comprehensive as, say, systems in Europe at the time. It excluded farm workers and domestic servants initially, but it was a fundamental shift. It established the principle that the federal government had a responsibility for the welfare of its citizens.
And you mentioned regional development.
Yes, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. This was a really bold experiment. It built a series of dams along the Tennessee River, which revitalized a huge, impoverished rural area spanning 7 states. It provided cheap hydroelectric power, controlled devastating floods, improved navigation, replanted forests, and taught farmers better techniques. It was a massive integrated development program. And there were other things, too. Government loans to help homeowners avoid foreclosure, funding for slum clearance and new housing, increased taxes on the wealthy and corporations, and, as we mentioned, the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. FDR famously remarked, "I think this would be a good time for a beer."
Any sweeping set of changes like that is bound to face opposition. Who were the main critics of the New Deal, and what were their arguments? He must have ruffled a lot of feathers.
Oh, absolutely. The New Deal faced considerable opposition from both the right and the left, which tells you just how much it shook things up. From the right, businessmen were probably the most vocal opponents. They vehemently disliked the increased government intervention in the economy, the growth of powerful trade unions fostered by the Wagner Act, the new regulations on hours and wages, and, of course, higher taxes. They feared it was creeping socialism, stifling private enterprise and individual initiative. State governments also often resented what they saw as federal interference in their internal affairs.
And the Supreme Court was a significant obstacle, too, wasn't it, for a while?
It certainly was, initially. The Supreme Court, dominated by older conservative judges who hadn't been appointed by Roosevelt, proved a major hurdle in his first term. They ruled several key New Deal measures unconstitutional, most notably the NRA and parts of the AAA. This created a real clash between the executive trying to expand federal power to fight the Depression and the judiciary sticking to more traditional interpretations of the Constitution. Eventually, the court became more agreeable, partly due to retirements allowing Roosevelt to appoint new justices during his second term.
What about criticism from the left?
Yes, there were critics on the left, too. Socialists and more radical figures argued the New Deal didn't go nearly far enough. They felt it propped up the capitalist system rather than fundamentally changing it, leaving too much power in the hands of big business. A prominent and very colorful critic was Huey Long, the populist governor of Louisiana. He launched his Share Our Wealth campaign, demanding a much more radical redistribution of wealth, proposing massive taxes on the rich to guarantee every family a minimum income, a house, a car, and a radio. He was becoming a serious political threat to Roosevelt before he was assassinated in 1935.
So pressure from both sides.
Definitely. Even within Roosevelt's own Democratic Party, particularly from 1936 onwards, more conservative, Southern Democrats became critical, especially as the new trade unions, encouraged by the New Deal, began flexing their muscles with major strikes. And of course, there was the popular, often derisive term alphabet agencies for the sheer number of new organizations created: this CCC, WPA, TVA, NRA, Triple SEC, FDIC. Ex-President Hoover famously satirized this proliferation of acronyms.
So despite that immense popularity with the forgotten men, ordinary Americans, unions, farmers, black people who started shifting to the Democrats, he clearly faced significant pushback. But in the end, the burning question: did the New Deal actually pull America out of the Depression? And if not, what finally did?
That really is the key question. And the answer is, well, it's nuanced. It's important to acknowledge straight up that the New Deal did not achieve all of FDR's hopes, and it certainly had limitations. For instance, the AAA, while helping many farm owners, unfortunately displaced many poorer farm laborers and sharecroppers. The terrible dust bowl in the mid-1930s, caused by drought and unsustainable farming practices on the Great Plains, also highlighted the limitations of government programs in the face of environmental disaster. And perhaps most critically, unemployment, though significantly reduced from its peak, it fell to less than 8 million by 1937, remained a serious problem throughout the 1930s. Roosevelt himself, concerned about the national debt, actually cut back on government spending in 1937-38, which triggered another recession, the Roosevelt recession, pushing unemployment back up again temporarily. So the crucial point is, the New Deal by itself did not fully rescue the USA from the Great Depression.
But it must have had major achievements. It changed so much.
Oh, absolutely. Its key successes were profound and long-lasting. It provided essential direct relief to millions of destitute Americans, preventing mass starvation and utter social collapse. It created millions of jobs through public works schemes like the CCC and WPA, giving people not just income, but also dignity and hope. It restored public confidence in the banking system and, importantly, in democracy and the government itself. Some historians argue it may even have prevented a more violent revolution by showing that the system could respond to people's needs. The infrastructure built the dams, bridges, schools, parks. The electrification brought by the TVA provided services of lasting value to the nation. And the Social Security Act was a vital foundational step towards creating a modern welfare state, establishing the government's ongoing duty to help the needy.
And politically?
Politically, Roosevelt's greatest achievement, many historians believe, was preserving the American middle way, democracy, and free enterprise at a time when economic hardship was driving other nations towards fascism or communism. He managed to reform capitalism enough to save it, essentially. He also significantly increased the power and authority of the federal government and laid down the structures and expectations for future economic and social policy management.
Okay, so if the New Deal didn't end the Depression alone, what did that?
The Second World War. That's the consensus. The U.S. began massively increasing military production to supply Britain and France even before officially entering the war, becoming the arsenal of democracy. Then, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the U.S. mobilized for war on an unbelievable scale. This massive war effort, building tanks, ships, aircraft, like 86,000 planes in 1943 alone, employing millions in factories, and the military caused industrial production to soar. The gross national product nearly doubled between 1939 and 1945. This created over 7 million extra jobs on top of the existing workforce, leading to almost full employment by late 1942. The war essentially did what the New Deal couldn't fully achieve. It wiped out unemployment. The U.S. emerged from WWII with full employment and rising wages, finally shaking off the last vestiges of the Great Depression.
We've charted an incredible, really tumultuous course then. from the immediate aftermath of a brutal civil war through an unprecedented economic ascent to devastating collapse and then a radical transformation of government's role in American life.
Exactly. And the story of the U.S. during this period isn't just about economic charts and political acts. It's fundamentally about the resilience of its people, that constant tension between individual liberty and collective responsibility, and the profound, often unpredictable impact of global events on the nation's destiny.
So maybe something for you, the listener, to consider. How might America's trajectory have differed if that roaring 20s prosperity had been more equitably distributed from the start? Or perhaps if the government had adopted a more interventionist approach earlier in the face of the downturn, would the Depression have been as severe or lasted as long?
Yeah, this deep dive really reveals how deeply interconnected social issues, economic policies, and global events truly are. They shape not just a nation's grand fate, but also the daily lives, the struggles, and opportunities of millions. It leaves us thinking about those fundamental questions of governance, social welfare, and what it truly means to be a melting pot, or maybe a salad bowl, in the face of immense, constant change questions that, continue to resonate very strongly today.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.